Well, we start off with a question today, probably a question that you can relate with a little bit. Have you ever been in a place or a position you would rather not be in? Never. Right? Everybody's thinking, duh. Pastor Terri, we've all kind of been in those. And sometimes it's by our own doing and our own poor choices, right, church? And sometimes it's a series of circumstances that kind of place us in that position, a place that we would rather not be in. In a Swan family, we call that between a rock and a hard place. You heard that saying? Between a rock and a hard place. Let's face it, living out our faith in the world around us sometimes puts us between a rock and a hard place. For instance, I'll give you an example. In a decision at work, in your workplace, maybe the decision was made and it kind of doesn't go along with what you think is right or doesn't fit in line with your faith, and maybe you don't even have a voice in that decision at work. Between rock and a hard place, right? What do you do? Well, we wrestle. We wrestle with these kinds of situations and maintaining our faith in the world. But we sung just a little while ago that God is faithful. God is faithful and will show us the way. So we're jumping into the middle of a powerful story here this morning in the book of Exodus. So it's important to remind you of what has taken place prior to the story that I'm going to read you in a bit, because if I didn't, it would be like jumping into the middle of a movie. You ever done that? Jumped in the middle of a movie? Joe Swan drives me crazy with this. I will be sitting and watching some series, and he'll plop down in the chair and go, "Who's that?" Well, what happened there? And I'm like, "Do you want me to start it over?" No, keep going. So it's important to hear a little of the backstory. We hear a conversation between God and Moses. Moses is the single most important figure in the Hebrew Bible, and Moses was in a position that he really didn't expect to be in, maybe didn't even want to be in. And it's the position of leading God's people out of bondage, out of Egypt to the promised land. And it's not an easy task. In fact, if we remember the story of Moses, he gives several excuses at the burning bush about why he shouldn't be the one that does this. And the epic story of his life and the deliverance of God's people from bondage and slavery is the defining story of the Jewish people. In fact, the Jewish tradition remembers this story over and over again. The book of Exodus tells the story of the chosen people of Israel. It moves us from slavery to freedom, from bondage by Pharaoh to a relationship with the one true God. And Exodus takes us through plagues, sea walls, wandering in the wilderness, fiery mountains, and golden calves. To set the scene for this morning's reading, we need to remember what has taken place. Moses has gone to the mountain of Sinai, and Aaron, his brother, has been left in charge. The people, just 5 or 6 weeks earlier, had been sealed into a covenant with God, and they had been sprinkled with the blood of the covenant, and now, before it's hardly dry, they have forgotten their vows. Moses is not in their sight. He's up on the mountain, and he's been there for 40 days. The people become impatient. You ever met some of those? The people become impatient. They wonder if God is still with them and if Moses is even still alive. All that has happened and how God has provided for them is becoming just this dim memory, and the people ask Aaron for a god to lead them. And what does Aaron do? Not what he's supposed to do. Not what he was told, of course. With Aaron's consent and counsel, they melt down their golden earrings and their bracelets and anything else they can find and mold them into the form of a golden calf. And then they make this golden calf as a sign of God's presence, and they worship this idol before them. Now, you remember the big 10 commandments, right? Remember this one? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness or anything that is in heaven above, or that it is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Moses was barely out the door before his own brother broke the commandment. So God speaks to Moses. You can almost hear this frustration in kind of a parent whose children are misbehaving the minute they are out of sight, right? Ever had any of those kids? I do. So God tells Moses, hurry up and go down. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, are ruining everything. They've already abandoned the path that I commanded. They have made a metal bull calf for themselves. They've bowed down to it and offered sacrifices to it and declared, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Lord said to Moses, I've been watching these people, and I've seen how stubborn they are. You know, God was upset, to say the least, with the Israelites. Notice that God referred to the people as your people, and these people, and not my people. It's sort of like when a parent is having a conversation about their child and, to the other parent and says, your son, your daughter did this, right? Doesn't want to claim his own people in this outrageous act. And Moses was in a place he really didn't want to be, between God and the disobedient people, out in the middle of nowhere with this group who is doing anything but what he had commanded. So we're going to be in chapter 33 of Exodus today. I'm going to kind of dissect a little bit of this story and talk a little bit about it. Moses took the tent and pitched it outside the camp, far away from the camp. Now, this is after he's come down from the mountain. He's had this conversation with God. And he called it the meeting tent. Everyone who wanted advice from the Lord would go to the meeting tent outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise and stand at the entrance to their tents and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the column of cloud would come down and stand at the tent's entrance while the Lord talked with Moses. When all the people saw the column of cloud standing at the tent's entrance, they would all rise and then bow down at the entrance to their tents. In this way, the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, like two people talking to each other. Then Moses would come back to the camp, but his young assistant Joshua, Nun's son, wouldn't leave the tent. Now, if we remember the story about how the people left Egypt, there would be a pillar of cloud that would guide the people and go before the people in the daytime, signifying God's presence. And at night, there would be a pillar of fire showing them the way, signifying God's presence. And so this pillar of cloud there is before the tent, the meeting tent, signifying that God is present. I love how it says, in this way the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face. This conversation, like two people talking to each other. Okay, so then we're going to hear Moses plead with God on behalf of the people. Moses said to the Lord, look, you've been telling me, lead these people forward, but you haven't told me whom you will send with me. Yet you've assured me, I know you by name and think highly of you. Now, if you do think highly of me, show me your ways so that I may know you and so that you may really approve of me. Remember, too, that this nation is your people. Moses reminds God, these are your people, not my people. They're your people. And the Lord replied, I'll go myself and I'll help you. Hear of God's presence? That song that we sang, right? I'll go myself, I'll help you. God will always be with us. Moses replied, if you won't go yourself, don't make us leave here. So I'm not really sure, right, that he's going to go with us. So I'm going to talk to him about it again. If you won't go yourself, don't make us leave here, because how will anyone know that we have your special approval, both I and your people, unless you go with us? Only that distinguishes us, me and your people, from every other people on the earth. And the Lord said to Moses, I'll do exactly what you've asked because you have my special approval and I know you by name. This relationship with God, this deep relationship with God, this special relationship with God. Then Moses goes even further. He says, please show me your glorious presence. He's asking to see the fullness of God, to see God in this wonderful way. And the Lord said, I'll make all my goodness pass in front of you. I'll proclaim before you the name, the Lord, and I'll be kind to whomever I wish to be kind, and I will have compassion to whomever I wish to be compassionate. But the Lord said, you can't see my face because no one can see me and live. The Lord said, here is a place near me where you will stand beside the rock. As my glorious presence passes by, I'll set you in the gap in the rock, and I'll cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I'll take away my hand, and you will see my back, but my face won't be visible. So God says, I'll show you my goodness. I'll show you my presence. I'll show you my glory in the way that I can. Now, it's been said that when we are at the lowest points in our lives, we are the closest to God. Would anybody agree with me on that? For you believers, followers of Jesus Christ, when we're at the lowest point of our life, we are the closest to God. Now, do I believe that God causes those low points? I don't. I believe that God allows his presence to be known in this wonderful way when we turn to God in those low points. But at such times, we turn to God knowing deep within our hearts that God is with us. And we will somehow see through our trials with God with us. Now, we see God's frustration in the story of Exodus. Wouldn't you be frustrated with the people? I mean, really. But we also see God's nature. Because like any good parent, there is forgiveness. Moses goes to God on behalf of the people, and as the Israelites would discover very soon, and we hold onto this truth, God remains with us and will never depart from us. Even when we're not doing the things we need to be doing. Even when we're far from God's ways, God is with us. Moses says, show me your ways. Can you say that? Show me your ways. Show me your ways. The prayer we hear Moses lift is a face-to-face with God on behalf of a sinful people. It's both a prayer that is personal, show me your ways, and it's a prayer of intercession for others. Show me your ways for your people. A heart-to-heart with a conversation with a dear friend. That's what prayer is, really. The cloud of God's presence covers us, and we meet God face-to-face in a conversation, pouring out our hearts to God in a way that we might not pour out our hearts to anyone else. In his deep and abiding friendship with the Lord, Moses made an important request. He knew God's nature, and he wanted to walk in that nature, not his own nature. And he knew God's stubborn people were going to make life hard. They had proven this again and again, and boy, don't we still prove it again and again as God's people. We're a stubborn lot, aren't we? We're a disobedient lot, but God's nature is there and God forgives. And in Romans it says there's grace upon grace poured down on us. He seems to be asking God, show me your plans. If Moses only knew what God had intended for his people, he'd help lead the people that way. And he asked God to show him. Moses knew that it would only work if it was God's way, not his own way. And so he puts himself in that place to have the face-to-face with God. He knew the people had been obstinate. Their stiff necks kept them from bowing down their hearts and their heads and submitting themselves to God. And he was in a place I can imagine he did not really choose for himself. Rock hard place. Adam Hamilton entitled his book on Moses as The Reluctant Prophet. Well, we see that in Moses. Yet Moses kept his faith. He was faithful. And he turned to God at every fork in the road. He put all of his chips on the table, so to speak. And he reminded God of his promises and that his favor was upon him and his chosen people. He reminded God that his children had some growing up to do. It's still a reminder today. God, we have some growing up to do. This incident from Exodus reminds us to trust God at all times. When we can't see the path before us, when we don't know what's next, when we're at that low place, when we're struggling, to lean in to God, to hold on to God when we don't know what to do, we don't know how to do anything else, to hold on to God. He teaches us to trust him. Now, while Moses might not have seen as much of God as he would have liked, he did see God's glory, didn't he? He asked to see God fully, and God said, I will show you my glory. Remember where it was that Moses came closest to God in those face-to-face conversations? Do you remember what that was called? The meeting tent, right? Outside the camp. He pitched a tent outside the camp, far away from the main camp, where other people and all day-to-day activity was taking place, far enough that he could be alone with God in this face-to-face, but close enough that the people could see him and could see God's presence there. You know, perhaps Labor Day weekend, when we take an extra day off from our everyday work, is a good time to think where we can pitch our tent to be with God. We have an extra day this week, most of us. Sorry, Tim. You're going to be working? So, I will be too. But, you know, we have this extra time to really kind of reflect and see where is our tent that we meet God in. Where do we go for silence, for prayer, for enough quiet and distance from the everyday concerns to hear the voice of God? Sometimes we have to carve that out intentionally. The days kind of seem to fill themselves with activities and work and family. And before we look up, we think, have we spent any time with God? I encourage you to take some of your extra time. Take a walk. The beautiful labyrinth right back here behind the church. Walk the prayer labyrinth. Sit in the quiet of a morning. Just carve some time away so that you might listen for the voice of God in your own life. All of us find ourselves in a place we would rather not be from time to time. But remember, God does some of his best revealing in those difficult places, because it is there that we ask God to show up. It's those places that we say, God, I need you now. God, I need you now. In fact, if you remember the whole story here, it is in that gap between the rock and the hard place that God allowed Moses to see his glory. Moses was open to what God had to say to him, what God was revealing. Now, Martin Luther, commenting on this passage in Exodus, claimed that we did see God fully when Jesus died on the cross. We did see the face of God in that moment. And we came face to face with God in our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. We find Jesus waiting for us in the meeting tent, wherever that might be, in worship, in a backyard, time walking, in music. We see the face of Jesus